The good old clap, take one.
That's right.
How many of you knew what you wanted to be when you were 7 years old? I did. I wanted to be world champion.
Hey, is there honesty involved in this podcast? Can we be honest?
You can shut your fucking lips.
And then I'll just say, put them up, what? Let's go.
He's like, you look too pretty on the wave. Get ugly.
We can talk about DMT if you want.
I thought we were boxing.
All right, so we have longtime tour surfer, big wave icon, and lowers guru Mike Snips Parsons on the lineup today. Snips, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Stoked to be a part of the show. I'm a big fan of the show and happy to be here.
Oh, well, that makes me feel really good. Huge fan of yours too. And I guess before we get into it, I always like to do a little scene set. You know, where are you at today for recording? Who are you hanging out with? What have you been up to?
Yeah, I'm in San Clemente at home. Today, just had a little surf at T Street, which is 5 minutes down the road, with my son, who's 14 now, as a frothing Grom surfer, and my wife. So we had a little family surf this morning, and just spent the weekend up in Mammoth in the mountains doing a little fishing and hiking. And previous to that, we had a really good swell at Lowers last week, so got a bunch of waves down there, and kind of just we're in the middle of a bit of a heat wave, so it looks like the Wsl Finals is going to be hot and lots of swell forecasted. So just super excited for that. All the guys and girls are in town warming up at Lowers. So I've been watching a bunch of that. It's been a good lead up so far. Waves aren't very good now, but looks good in a few days.
That's very cool. And you know, before we get into it too, just because you brought up T Street, I'm always reminded of the Bill Ballard film about Matt Archibald, Archie, which you feature in pretty heavily. And I think it was you who said, you know, San Clemente is such a cool town to train to be an elite level surfer, because we'd all go down to T Street in the morning, and then when the wind would hit it, we'd all go to Lowers in the afternoon. I'm pretty sure you said that. I'm wondering how true that is today, because I think back and I'm like, man, if they're all at T Street in the morning, I should have gone to Lowers in the morning and just avoided the pack.
Oh God, yeah, T Street's a rad little stomping grounds for everyone, all levels of surfing. But back in the day, Archie, the Fletchers, Dino, Shane Beshin, and his brother, just an incredible crew, used to surf down there early mornings. And then when like Martin Potter and Tom Carroll would come to town, they would stay in San Clemente and always surf out there. So a lot of good memories of those times. And it's just a really consistent wave. It's not very good, but it wedges up on this little reef, and it's good on high tide. It's always something to ride. So it's kind of our little go-to if you want a 20-minute session, hour session. You don't have to bike all the way down to Lowers. And it kind of prepares you for a lot of different breaks around the world. When I did the tour, it was really similar to some of the waves in Japan or Brazil, and so it was a good little training grounds. If your boards went good at T Street, they usually went good around the world. Super hard wave to ride, frustrating. Like goes flat and then peaks up, and you got to jump across sections. It was actually good training for Sandy Beach in Hawaii. So yeah, if you can surf good at T Street, you're on your way to being a really good groveler. It's not a great wave, but super fun beach and good vibes, and an insanely competitive group of surfers. Especially nowadays, it's just a hotbed of young talent, male and female.
I love it. Well, Snips, you've been kind enough to join us for this very special Rip Curl WSL Finals preview episode. You know, your career as a professional surfer, big wave icon, super coach, etc. It may make some appearances here in this episode, but I want listeners to rest assured that we're going to schedule a full deep dive episode into you in the future. But for now, we are recording on Thursday, September 1st. This episode's going to drop on the eve of the 2022 Rip Curl WSL Finals, so it'll be on Tuesday, September 6th. And while the call for what day we run obviously resides with our head of sport, Jesse Miley-Dyer, what are you seeing as of today as the most likely run day for the finals?
It looks really tricky to me at this point for a couple different reasons. You have a lot of similar size swell coming. You kind of have 2 or 3 swell events over the waiting period. There's a dropping swell on the 8th that could be still pretty good. Then you have more long period coming in on the 9th. And then that swell kind of tapers a little on the 10th, but still has potential that day. Then you have a slow taper, but possibly a little tropical swell mixing in. And then you have another long period swell around the 14th, 15th. That one's just starting to look stronger on the charts right now. So the good news is there's going to be good options. It's not going to be as big as last year by the looks of it. But I like lowers in that sort of 4 to 5 foot range anyway. When it gets too big, it tends to wash through and close out a little bit and doesn't have as good of a wall. So Jesse's got good problems. Lot of last year was hard too. I think she nailed it by waiting for the day that they ran, because the day before they ran last year's finals was pretty good, little weird. She waited and nailed the day of the year. It hasn't been that good since that day last year. But I am excited about the forecast. I think it's going to be good lowers in the 4 to 5 foot range. Things to consider are there's potential south wind on one of those early days, but the wind models usually aren't that accurate a week out, so I don't trust those yet. Got to watch that tropical swell. It could mess things up, make really southeast energy come in and play. You also have the potential for northwest swell coming down the coast, which is what we have right now, which makes the water cold, and it's not that good for lowers. For lowers, you want a pure south swell with nothing else in the way. From about 210 degrees is ideal, maybe all the way to 220. When it's a little more southwest, the right gets longer and better. When the swells are too south, right off of Chile, like the 180 swells, the right closes out quicker, left kind of pushes out to sea. So there's a lot of factors. And the other big factor is tide. You've got low tide in the afternoon at the early part of the waiting period, which I don't like because lowers really loses energy on low tide and it gets softer. It really gets good from about a 2 foot tide to about a 5 foot tide. So that's when it moves in on the rocks and has more power. Later in the waiting period, 14, 15 has better tides. You got a 5 foot high tide midday, so you almost could run the whole event with 2.5 to 3 feet of tide, which I really like that. But that swell is a lot further out there. But we'll have a really good idea by the time this airs of what that swell looks like. So a lot of good options, a lot of things to consider. It seems really straightforward at lowers. The swell comes from 8,000 miles away. It's easy to know that it's coming and it's going to be there. But the details of wind and tide and northwest wind swell or tropical swell, some things that could mess it up, are something that they should highly consider.
Yeah, and you kind of answered this next question a little bit, but as someone who arguably has more experience than anyone in terms of surfing the wave and making event calls and poring over the forecasting data, you kind of touched on this, but if you had a blank slate, what would you define as the ideal conditions for high performance surfing at lower Trestles? Because for some people, they're like, oh, bigger the better. But as you pointed out, sometimes that washes through there. So if you had to kind of dreamcast a forecast for this event, wave height, swell direction, period, tides, wind, like what would be the Mike Parsons special?
Yeah, I like this time of year the most. September, this is a great month because we tend to get this hotter weather and we get like a northeast flow in the morning of wind, which is straight offshore but light. So nowadays, a lot of the surfers like onshore wind for airs and that. But what a northeast wind early does is it creates super clean conditions for turns. And then by about midday, the wind sort of settles and stops. And by late afternoon, it's usually like a light onshore, which stays glassy and good. So love this time of year, but ideal everything would be about 3 to 3.5 feet of pure swell. I like 16-second interval. So I don't really think it's best on the first day of the swell when it's a bigger period. It's more inconsistent. That 18, 19-second stuff, it has more power, but the swells, the sets are further apart, right? So once the energy drops a little, the interval to that 16, 15-second range, you get better consistency. So I love 3 to 3.5 feet of swell, 16 seconds, maybe even dropping to 15 for consistency. 210 to 220 in direction. You don't want shadowing from Tahiti, but sometimes the swells will run up next to New Zealand and they'll be really good for South Shore Hawaii. And those ones are also really good for lowers because it makes the right line up all the way halfway to Churches. So those are the ones I love when it's 5 feet, 4 to 5 feet. And yeah, that's usually about 3.5 feet of swell at 16 seconds. If it's pure south swell, like I mentioned earlier, no wind swell in the way, that's when you just get ruler edge perfect lowers. And we've had a few events that have had that. One that comes to mind was, I think Luke Egan won one of the early ones, a Boost Mobile Pro. It was phenomenal. Last year, I felt was a teeny bit too big, especially on the lower tide. Everyone kind of had to go right, and it was really tricky and hard. I think the performances were a little bit conservative because it was hard to get a good one. It was long paddle outs. I feel like it's better at 4 feet where there's more opportunity. I think the surfers will surf better. And I think we're looking at that this year.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up the Luke Egan year because, my memory is a little fuzzy, but yeah, geez, you either contest directed or at least aided contest directors in the call for a number of years at Lower Trestles, whether it was Billabong or Boost or probably Hurley. And I know you mentioned Luke Egan. I want to say that was like 2001, 2002, maybe.
I think so.
But are there any other, memorable events for you, in terms of, maybe how good the waves got, or even on the other hand, like how challenging it got, whether it was wave conditions or fog or whatever else?
Yeah, there's some challenges. I remember one year the final was not very good because of the low tide with Kelly Slater and Poncho Sullivan. That was tough because Kelly was super smart, jumped on a few waves. Poncho waited for sets and got nothing. There was a really great year. I remember an insane final with Kelly and Taj Burrow. Was such a good final. I think that was one of the Boost Mobile Pro events. That was just so competitive. Those guys were going back and forth in perfect waves. The Luke Egan, I think it was maybe Mick Campbell he was against in the final, or I think it was 2 goofy footers, and I think
that
Luke
sounds
won.
right. Yeah.
And that had a hurricane swell and a south swell mix. So you had this crazy hurricane swell with shorter period, and you had a big southern hemi swell all in the same day. And the surf was pumping. I remember Danny Wills was surfing incredible that year too, and Sonny Garcia. Perfect surf, sunny day, hot, like 90-degree weather. That was one of the best years ever. There was another year where Kelly got barreled in the final. He's won it, like 6 times. He's had so many insane performances out there. So that was memorable. A few other really good ones. There was 1 or 2 finals that were tough where we had a super strong northwest wind. I think maybe Taj was in the final of that one. Wasn't that good. So yeah, ideally you want those mid to higher tides later in the day so the finals are really good, because that drained out low tide is never a great look for lowers.
Right. With the Rip Curl WSL Finals being, it's a single day event between the best surfers of the season for the world title. And, while it's not your call on when we run this year, I'm curious if you thought about whether, having been a contest director in the past, you think it's an easier thing to pick the single best day out of an entire window, or was it maybe easier to have to not have that pressure and just manage like a bunch of days as we've had to do at events in the past?
I think it's way easier to manage a bunch of days. Nailing a single day is so tough because, as a contest director, you're always, the bird in the hand is kind of the thing, right? If you've got good surf in front of you, you usually run something, you usually go. Where this is really hard because I had some experience as the big wave commissioner, and that was like this, a single day, picking those epic 1-day events, and they're so hard because there's so many factors that go into it. And so if you let a few good days go and you wait for that second swell and it doesn't pan out, then you're boxed into a corner where your one day isn't the day you were looking for. So I think it's way harder to pick one single day, especially when you've got to run a pretty decent amount of time that day. So you can't just stop if the wind gets funky or something comes up that you didn't expect, like fog delays, things like that. It's a lot tougher to consider all that stuff and nail just one perfect day. So I think that's more challenging.
We have this really incredible collection of, the WSL Final Five this year. We've got, Kanoa and Steph and Idolo and Brisa and Ethan and Tatiana, Jack, Joanne, Felipe and Carissa. And they've had to perform, in all these different ways throughout the year and perform very, very well just to get an opportunity to come to lower trestles and compete for a world title. Obviously, surfers at the elite level use different types of equipment at different kinds of waves. Do you foresee, any of the Final Five surfers on either side, men's or women's, like focusing in on really specific equipment for lower trestles? Or would it be more of a case of, look, my high performance boards that I've used in other similarly positioned waves throughout the year are what I'm going to use here because I'm confident on it?
It's a super good question. It depends on the forecast a little bit. And judging on the forecast we've got, I think they're regular high performance boards that say they would use in Brazil or El Salvador or a few of those other types of events, maybe even small J Bay, would work really good at lowers. But if it doesn't come through quite as big as forecasted, that's when it gets a little trickier, because lowers can be a pretty soft wave. And some of the best equipment can be something that's a touch more concave, a little faster, and maybe a little looser. Even more so than a board, say, you would use in the wave pool, where it's a little more sucky, or a wave like Snapper that has that steep wall. Lowers can be a wave where you need to generate speed and be quick and get around sections, and use a board that's a touch faster, looser, and quicker. So it's a great question. I think for the most part, the regular sort of go-to short boards will be the ones they ride. But a lot of that depends on the forecast.
That's interesting too. And I mean, on the board topic, just to stick on this for a second, like, of those 10 surfers, you got 5 that are riding Sharp Eyes Marcio Zovi, which is like an incredible story in and of itself. 2 are on DHDs. One's on Timmy Patterson's, one's on Glenn Pang, and then one's on Mayhem. A lot of them have sort of local bases in and around San Clemente, Mayhem probably being, the most associated with lower trestles. You've worked with surfers at the elite level in the past, like Mick Fanning specifically when it comes to lowers. And whether it was that year or another year, Mick has sort of famously jumped on Mayhems as well, just because of how in tune those kind of crafts are with lower trestles. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about that process of testing different shapers, the difference between testing them for a normal CT event versus the finals, and things like that.
That's another really good question. I think Matt's boards are unbelievable in California. And when I spoke about the smaller waves and generating that really quick burst of speed when you need it, his boards have been amazing at that. And Mick experimented with some of Kaloe's old boards at lowers, and I know he took some of those back and showed Darren, and I know that Mick's board in 2015 when he won was definitely influenced by Matt's shapes and riding those boards earlier that in previous years. Marcio at Sharp Eye, he's close to here, and his boards tend to go really well at lowers. All of his athletes look like their boards are glued to their feet. If you think about Jack or Kanoa or Joanne, Tati, their boards look magic at lowers. And I think that, Felipe, their equipment's going to be insane there. Darren's boards, to me, like for Ethan and Steph, Darren will know that lowers can be a bit gutless. So I would imagine Ethan and Steph's boards will be maybe a touch more of a small wave version that they ride at lowers. I think the shapers will make adjustments for California waves. Like, everyone in California always says, like, they take a board to Australia and they're like, damn, this board was so good. And even when I was doing the tour, that was the case. It would go so good at lowers, and you'd get to Snapper and you'd be like, oh no, I need more rocker. This wave's tighter. So lowers is its own beast a little bit, but I think at this point, all 10 surfers are pretty clued in to what the wave's like, and their shapers are as well.
The Rip Curl WSL Finals has this unique and, in a lot of ways in surfing, really innovative format that we saw for the first time last year, where the 4th and 5th seed surf in the opening match. The winner of that surfs against the 3rd seed. The winner of that surfs against the 2nd seed. And then the winner of that surfs in a best 2 out of 3 against the number 1 seed for the world title. And it was interesting talking about the format before we actually ran the event. And, we'd talk with, Pat O'Connell about it, or we'd talk with a lot lot of the surfers about it, and we'd sort of like fan cast, like, well, do you want to be number one and just go into the water cold where, you know, your challenger's got all this momentum? Do you want to be in the middle, et cetera, et cetera? And it's funny to kind of go back and listen to some of those answers before we ran the finals last year. We run the finals, and now virtually every surfer I talk to is like, well, as we should have known, like being the number one seed has all the advantage, because you just have to win 2 heats and you have the world title. You get a third one if you need it. You're refreshed. You're ready to go. But I'm curious to get your take as a former elite level competitor as well. Number one, do you agree number one position in this format is ideal? But if not, where would you want to sit in those rankings, just from your own kind of competitive psychology?
Yeah, definitely agree. As we learned last year, I mean, a lot of people were talking that way, like, hey, having momentum and getting a heat or two under your belt. But you're talking about the best 5 men and best 5 women at this event only. So momentum's out the door. It's every heat forward is a huge advantage. You're coming up against the best right off the bat. So as we learned, like Stephanie's opening heat last year, she didn't look quite ready to go, and it was early in the morning, and it caught her off guard, and she was out. So it's like, had she have won that heat, she may have, you know, went all the way to the final. You never know. So those are the things. Like, being number one is a massive advantage. We saw Medina. He waited. He wasn't down there. He walked down to the beach a half hour before the heat, didn't watch anything, probably watched at home, was completely fresh. And you know, Felipe had to battle to get to that spot, got into the finals. You could tell he was, even with the one heat he got through, to me, he looked a little fatigued by the last heat. So run the table from 4th or 5th is going to be incredibly tough, no matter how good you are. Huge advantage to be in that number one spot. And yeah, momentum's one thing, but it's the heats out there are quick. You know, 35 minutes. You've got to be in rhythm. You can't miss a set. Huge advantage to be seated higher, no doubt.
Very cool. We're going to take a quick break to get a word in from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. So, as we mentioned in the intro, we're going to have a full, in-depth Mike Parsons episode scheduled in the future. But for the purposes of this next segment, I was wondering if we could just skim a little bit off the top and get the lay of the land in terms of what you do these days for a living, in terms of management, coaching, and who you've been working with recently.
Yeah, so currently I work for IMG as a manager. I've managed Kanoa Igarashi, Lakey Peterson, Caroline Marks, Jackson Dorian, and Cade Madsen. I was brought into that about 10 years ago. I met Kaloe Andino's manager, and he brought me into the loop to sort of slowly build their surf program. So the first surfer I signed was Kanoa, and then Lakey, and then more recently, Caroline, Jackson, and Cade. So it's been really fun learning from him. Our group also manages Kai Lenny. So that's kind of our group. So I spend a lot of my time managing those athletes and their contracts and their scheduling, and doing things for their sponsors and helping out with all their activations and things like that. And then on the coaching front, I coach Kaloe Andino, Caroline Marks, and Lakey Peterson. This year, I went to the first 5 events with those 3 surfers, and then at the back end of the year, I've sort of picked and choose. So yeah, I've been lucky. Those are the 2 jobs that I have. It keeps me really busy, and they kind of go hand in hand, because I need to be around the events for the managing side, and I love the coaching, because that's my background, and what I'm the most passionate about is these surf contests and being there. I'm just ultra competitive and love everything about pro surfing. It's an awesome job.
That's perfect. And you know, the reason I kind of wanted to set that up is because I'd love to get your insights on how the 2022 season went, just from you're so close to not only your own athletes, but you competed yourself previously, and you know so many of the other athletes, but it was kind of a wild ride in a lot of ways. It was the first full-flighted year of the Redesign Championship Tour. We shot everyone out of a cannon at Pipeline in sort of peak season. We had 5 events. There was the mid-season relegation that sharpened the men's and women's fields by a third, the return to G-Land, El Salvador, pumping Jeffreys Bay, and the return of women to Chopu after 16 years. It was a lot. And I'll start with when it comes to your own charges, whether it's the surfers you manage or just the surfers you coaches or a blend of both. Did you do anything in particular to prepare for 2022 with them that was maybe different than you'd done in previous years?
Not so much, but maybe we should have. It was really hard. I think just the sheer how quick it went and how much travel there was this year and how everyone was globetrotting around the world so much. I think that was the biggest challenge. So to keep everyone mentally sharp and really excited about each event, that was the biggest challenge because of all the travel. And some of the events we were arriving like the day before their heats and stuff. Whereas in the past, especially like when they got to Brazil, it was one day of travel because it's so hard to change the tickets from El Salvador. I remember Lakey had to wake up and compete the very next morning in the first heat. So she arrived at night, had to surf a heat the next morning. Those were the hard things, I think, this year to manage all that. So in preparation, we spent a lot of time in Hawaii because that was the focus. You've got 5 events before that mid-season cut, which was gnarly because they were all, I felt, in a certain type of wave. So Hawaii and that type of surfing was the most important training to do, because Margaret's is a lot like Hawaii. So 3 of the 5 events were in kind of what we would call heavy water waves. So we spent a lot of time in Hawaii and just trying to put time in at Pipe and Sunset, especially on the girls' side, because those were new events for them. It was good. We learned a lot. I think on the girls' side, I think next year is going to be awesome because they got that experience. And as you mentioned, Tahiti as well. So that was cool. And on the men's side, I think everyone's going to be really prepared to be just on their game next year at the start of the year, because one slip up, we saw a lot of good surfers, really good surfers that didn't make that cut. And if they could have those moments back, just be a little more prepared for those first 5 events, because you got to come out of the gates firing, because as we learned, it's 5 events is quick for that cut. And some really good surfers missed out.
Yeah, and it was fascinating too, in the sense of we're coming out of sort of a COVID pandemic, economic impact, everything. So that put even kind of further strain on just, even how expensive it was to travel, and all these things are really, really upended from what it was before. But yeah, I think you're right. Like even kind of going back through the rankings from the start of the year and reviewing these events, we have season 2 of Apple TV Plus's Make or Break. I'm a producer on, and we're working on the episodes for next season. And they don't follow the events necessarily sequentially. They're more kind of subject focused. But, we'll have an episode with Betty Lou Sakura Johnson, and I'm like, oh, wow, like she had a great result like at Sunset Beach and a pretty good result at Pipe, and then she didn't make the cut, and I started kind of digging in, and there were a lot of those moments where on both the men's and women's side where you think like, oh, that person got a pretty good result early on. They got one in Hawaii, and then it just cratered, and they couldn't scramble their way back. And, I wasn't on the ground in Australia this year, but I was in Garageagon, and it was very interesting. And talking to my colleagues that were on the ground in Margaret River, they said it's maybe the most emotional event we've ever been at, because there are people that are going to be relegated to the Challenger Series, and it's becoming very, very real for them. And I was saying to them, it is probably about as far away from the vibe as you can get for Garageagon, because everyone was not only safe for the back 5 events of the year, but they'd secured qualification for the start of 2023. So it felt like, despite the waves not being that great in Indonesia this year for our event, this huge exhale with all the surfers, because they're like, oh, all right, we made it. We kind of got over the wall, and now we can relax before these next few events.
Yeah, no doubt. There was a couple things throughout the year that were like that. It was all about making the cut, and then it changed all about the top 5. So you saw that incredible shift after Margaret's. And yeah, the Margaret's event was really heavy. There was so many heats that, that was it. You had, Joao's heats were incredibly emotional. That interview was super powerful. You had Connor Coffin. He went from making the Final Five and he needed to make his heat at Margaret's and missed the cut. It was just so really hard to watch because he's such an amazing surfer and to not make the cut. So the drama was incredibly high at that event. The vibe was like nothing I've ever seen at a contest. Like people were really nervous and anxious and, on what days to run, what type of surf they were going to get. It was high drama, which, I've talked to a lot of people since I got home and they were like, wow, that was so intense. And a lot of people loved it. A lot of people thought, a lot of people don't like the cut. A lot of people do like it. There's a lot of debate on that, obviously. But in the end, I think then it shifts to the top five, and that's the focus from Margaret's on. And we saw that, and some of the things I noticed with that was if the guys felt like, or girls felt like they weren't going to make the top five, they sort of lost a little bit of interest towards the last 2 or 3 events. So that was something that I picked up on as well. But then ultimately with, the last couple of events and when we got to Tahiti with the drama of the top five was just insane. But, like Lakey's heat against Brisa came down, winner goes into the top five. Griffin battle with Kanoa was insane. It was so interesting. And, I had so many debates with my friends every day, like who's going to make it? Who do you think? It was really interesting and really intense there as well.
Yeah. Having been on the ground for those first 5 events, you had Kelly Slater and Moana Jones-Wong win the Billabong Pro Pipeline. You got Brisa Hennessy and Barry Mamiya win the Hurley Pro Sunset Beach. I might just pause there, for the Hawaii events, but pretty radical, obviously, seeing, at that point, near 50-year-old Kelly Slater win at Pipeline. Although I guess for a lot of us that have been around it that long, spots like Pipe and spots like Tahiti and spots like Cloudbreak, just, it still feels like he's a walk-up start to make at least the quarters, if not win the event. Is that fair from your perch as well when it comes to Kelly Slater and some of these critical waves?
It is, but I think we forget how amazing it is, what he did, because
right.
he's still so relevant in those waves. You just watched him in Tahiti just a week ago. It was unbelievable in the free surfs and in the event. But that was the best win I've ever seen in my life. It was so spectacular, the way he did it, and walking up late to Pipe with no real preparation, coming from Florida, and just the connection he has with that wave and being able to do it against those guys at that level, like Barron and those guys who surf there every swell. I mean, it was just out of this world. I mean, it still gives me chills to think about watching it. I made a bunch of bets with my friends that he was going to win, and I was screaming and yelling, and we had just such a good time. It was like, I don't know. It was just, the best event I've ever seen. Definitely the best win I've ever seen him have. And just being on the beach that whole day, watching it all go down, it was pretty memorable.
There's been no shortage of punditry and speculation about why didn't he go out on top? Why didn't he leave after the win at Pipeline and say, that's my swan song, and I couldn't figure out a better way to end my career. I couldn't dream up a better way to end my career. And I want to say that Kelly's even been fairly candid about that too, at least being like, I'm kind of thinking I thought I'd do that. But once he won, there was a lot of debate on our side if he was going to turn up to Sunset Beach or Portugal or do the rest of the year. But in my brain, I kind of thought it's a little bit like, Lestat from Interview with the Vampire. As soon as he gets a taste for winning, the fangs come out. And I'm sure in his brain, he's just like, I'm going to be in the finals. Like, of course. So why would I hang it up?
For sure. I think that's exactly where he went. He just went, wait a minute, I've won lowers like 6 times. I have 1 win. You start doing the math going, well, I could win Tahiti as well. I'm crazy successful at J-Bay. Even more recently, he's had some results there. I thought he was going to do it after Pipe. I was like, I think he's going to get in the top 5. And then his performance at Sunset was like one of the worst heats I've ever seen him surf. It was, I think, the overlapping format. He went way up the point, had a terrible heat. Kind of like the one he just had in Tahiti where he was just really off the mark. So, but I totally agree with you. I think his mind just instantly went to, I got a shot at the title. I think he watched lowers last year and was like, hey, if I'm in a single day event and I'm on a heater and everything goes right, I think I still have a shot at this. And I know he believed that. And I believed it. I was like, maybe he can squeak in the top 5 still. And but man, yeah, I debated the same debate. Like all my friends and almost everyone I talked to was like, man, that was the perfect time for him to kick out. Why didn't he do it? It just would have been the ultimate sort of Michael Jordan. I'm going out on top. But then Jordan made his comeback. And so yeah, I think it's hard to stay away. You're just so addicted to that feeling. There's nothing like it. And I'm super stoked he didn't retire. I hope he does it for a long time. He's just so interesting to still have around the events and such a huge draw, and he's still so crazy relevant. It's ridiculous.
It's so funny because I'm in my my 17th year at the ASPWSL, and I remember when I started, like it was a sport and an organization and a surfing industrial complex. It was really kind of wrestling with itself around like this insecure kind of grasping at mainstream acceptance. But it was one of those funny things where it's like, you don't have to pretend to be something you're not. It's actually like you're going to be accepted by the masses the truer you get to it. And Kelly, when I came on in early 2006, late 2005, was still like the vessel for that, but trying to work with him from any standpoint, and I didn't have to do it directly when I started, but people were trying to say like, oh, he's the this of surfing or the that of surfing or the this of surfing. But even back then, I'd kind of thought like he's gone so far beyond the horizon of what, human potential is. There really isn't a comp, where you're like, you should do it like this person because it worked for that person, because he's really in a league of his own. And that was 17 years ago. And here we are like in 2022. And it's like, yeah, I'd love to see him keep going, because it's like, why not?
Absolutely. I feel the exact same way. I think, with Pipe starting in that schedule, you know he's going to do Pipeline next year. He just to surf it, and again he'll be faced with the same question if he does well. Because I think at his point in time, it'd be really easy to pick like 3 events and go, hey, I'm going to do Tahiti, do Pipe, and maybe I'll do J Bay, and just sort of, maybe I'll commentate a few and go get a bunch of perfect waves. He's such a freak for wanting to get. He hates missing good waves anywhere in the world, and he's still so freaked out about someone scoring and him not being there, which is probably why, or it is why he's so good, because he's so obsessed with scoring waves and getting super barreled. But yeah, he's going to be faced with the same questions, and it's not like he's going to be any worse next year than this year. If he's surfing a lot lately and he looks really healthy and he's crazy fit, working on his body still, like he could go a lot longer, which is super weird to say.
It wasn't designed with this intention in mind, but it does parallel for me back when he was sponsored by Quicksilver, and Quicksilver had the opening event of the year on the Gold Coast. So he would always turn up to that event, even if he was like, I'm done, I'm retired, I won a lot of world titles and da-da-da. He would always turn up to that event because it was his sponsor's event. And his track record there was so silly. Like he'd do so well there. So oftentimes he'd do well enough to the point where the public momentum was like, you have to go for another world title. And he'd be like, all right, so he'd go down to belts. I guarantee there were probably 5 years in that span where he didn't want to do the tour, but it just like the collective momentum after that first event really pushed him in there. So I think we might see something similar with Pipeline, as you pointed out.
Yeah, and I think the way he does the tour now is like, it's really different, right? He shows up last second always. He tends to look like he's having a really good time, plays a lot of golf. It's not like he's grinding warm-up sessions like everybody else at Margaret River 5 days before the event. You never see him free surf anywhere at the events before his heat. So I think he's taking it like, hey, when I'm competing, I'm going to put a lot into it, but he's not living and dying on these events like, say, Kanoa or Griffin or Italo or, Lakey Caroline, those people that are just so focused on being there and winning that event,
Totally. Going now that we've given Kelly his due, or I'm sure we'll have to do that again at some point, but, looking at the upcoming generations of surfers, he was paired with a very impressive wildcard win from Moana Jones-Wong at Pipeline. She was just so dominant. And then at Sunset Beach, you had Costa Rica's Brisa Hennessy, who actually fell off the CT last year, earned her way back on via the Challenger Series, and then won the Sunset Beach and was world number one, which I think was a great kind of proof point for how those two tours can interact. And she was joined by, wildcard Baron Mamiya, who performed well at Pipe and then won Sunset, and he was world number one after that. And we go to Portugal, Tatiana Weston Webb, Griffin Colapinto, Bells Beach, Tyler Wright, Felipe Toledo, Margaret River, Jack Robinson, Isabel Nichols. I blew through those first 5 events because I know you were on the ground, but, looking at what you saw in those first 5 events through the prism of who eventually qualified for the Rip Curl WSL Finals, were there any performances that stood out for you, even mental performances, I guess, on either the men's or women's side across those first 5 events?
Yeah, there was definitely a few. It was interesting that the wild card topic was a big one. I mean, Moana really dominated Pipe, and that was an eye opener for the women. I think had the swell stayed a little smaller and been backdoor, I think Carissa, Tyler, Lakey, who were in that battle, may have been able to beat her. But once it turned into sort of real Pipe in those lefts, I think she was just so dominant. So I think the message was really clear when the girls left Pipe that they got to get better at sliding down the face, backside, and getting under the hood and making those bigger lefts. Baron at Sunset was pretty insane. No one expected that. That was really cool to watch. He kind of the hometown hero with his friends there. He surfed really consistent and really well. And, I think going on from there and qualifying was a huge story. But on the men's side, the real standout, I think, in the first 5 events and just taking control of the world title race was Felipe. I mean, his performance at Bells was insane. I think it was a heat against John where he just went lights out. He went to another gear on one of the bigger days and threw down a couple high 9s in one of those heats where I was like, wow, I've never seen Philippe surf that good in my life. It was like one of those statement heats, like this could be his year. And then on the women's side, it kind of flip-flopped with a bunch of different winners at first. You had Tati winning in Portugal, that she came from behind and didn't have some results. Carissa was really consistent. Super strong in every event. So that started to take shape early on. But yeah, I think from the girls' side, the Moana dominating Pipe was the big story. And on the men's side, for me, it was Felipe's performance. And even some of Felipe's heats at Margaret's in the years before and last year, he was really strong.
Yeah. And then obviously post mid-year relegation, we're in Garagegon, Jack Robinson, Joanne DeFay take home the wins. El Salvador, Steph Gilmore, Griffin Colapinto, Sakurema, Felipe Toledo, Carissa Moore, J-Bay, which was pumping, Tatiana Weston Webb, Ethan Ewing, which was rad to see. And then Tahiti, Courtney Conlog and Miguel Pupo, who collected his first CT win after nearly a decade since his rookie season. If you had to balance the pre-relegation events and the post-relegation events, do you feel like the same kind of contenders performed consistently across the year, or did you feel like people switched on in the back half compared to the first half that ended up, paying dividends for them in terms of qualifying for the finals?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I feel like a little bit of the same, but there was a bit of a shift, I think, with like on the men's side with Jack Robinson, Ethan, and Griffin just absolutely blitzing and kind of becoming these new world title contenders right before your eyes. And even Kanoa to some extent with his consistency. That, to me, happened a little more in the back half of the year, especially with Ethan's performance at J-Bay. Jack Robinson just was amazing all year. His performance at Margaret's and G-Land, and just how clutch he became, like always in the back half of heats when he needed a score, he got it. This year, he's been the most in tune surfer and mentally the strongest, kind of like Gabriel Medina in the past, where you just had this feeling like Jack's going to pull it off. And it was insane to watch. Like, he wasn't someone I thought at the start of the year was going to be that surfer. So for me, he's the biggest surprise and the most confident surfer on the tour right now. And he's kind of taken this thing by the reins and went, I'm going to win this title. And you can see it in his performances and how he approaches events. And I don't particularly think lowers is his strongest wave, but man, oh man, is he on a roll right now? So he's going to be tough. But I was really impressed with those three, Ethan, Griffin, and Jack on the men's side. And then on the women's side, to me, the best performance I thought was Tatiana on her backside at J-Bay, winning that event. And there was, I think it was the semis where she was going so tight to the pocket and just surfing really confident and strong. And, her getting so close last year with a second. I feel like she's just really determined in that mindset right now where I think she's going to be really tough at lowers. So yeah, those were some of the back half of the year highlights for me. And then, in Tahiti, Courtney was really comfortable. You could tell from heat one. I always thought she would be the toughest there. I don't think a lot of people realized how good her backhand tube riding, her technique is. So I knew she was going to be super strong, and it was really cool to see her win because she's always so strong and so good in heavy water waves, and that was really epic to watch.
One of the things that you touched on, and something that I've been thinking about a lot too, is the idea of mental strength. And we had Tatiana on last week's episode of the lineup, and she was so candid about what psychologically it did to her last year at the finals, arguably and almost inarguably, coming one turn away from winning a world title. And she's like, I couldn't surf. I didn't surf pretty much from the finals up until like a week before pipe. I was traveling with my husband, Jesse Mendez, on the Challenger Series. I had to leave. Like, it really, really did a number on her. And so I bring that up because it really almost derailed her start to the 22 CT. She had two poor results. Then she comes back with a win in Portugal. She rallies. She gets that win in pumping waves at Jeffreys Bay, and now she's back in the finals this year, which is, to me, just really impressive from a mental strength standpoint. And the other person you mentioned too, and just as someone who's observed elite level surfing as long as I have too, is I wouldn't have picked Jack Robinson to be someone that just feels so psychologically sharp to the point where, outside of the very, very serious waves of consequence that we've seen him dominate for a long time, be so good in some of these other waves. Obviously, Margaret Rivers is home, but that's not always an easy thing. But, backhand and kind of small garagegon, just really impressive stuff. And it does feel like that mental strength's getting a little bit more of its due in terms of being able to compete at this level.
It's a really good point. I mean, in this sport, confidence is everything, and that having that strong mind and having that confidence and being dialed in your program with your coaching, with your traveling, with who you're around, who you surround yourself with, all these things that go into it. And those highs and lows are so radical. Like mentioning Tatiana, if she makes that turn last year, she's the world champ, and she fell. And those are really hard to recover from. You look back in the history of the sport, there's quite a few surfers who never got the world title. They got second a lot, and they struggled in years after with dealing with that. A few of my really good friends, actually, and that's so credit to Tatiana to bouncing back so quickly, like you said. And Jack's been impressive with that. I think Ethan's found his confidence. I think Kanoa's crazy confident. You look at almost every surfer in the top 10, and at some point throughout the year, they looked invincible, or like when they start to know and believe that they can do it, that's when the light switch goes off. You saw it with Griffin getting 2 wins. And once you kind of get that win or that moment or that 9-point ride, you just see them lift and go, okay, I deserve to be here. I belong. Now I'm going. And that's sometimes really what it takes, is just one key moment that will turn around your entire year. And it's hard too, with all the travel, with the stress, and you got sponsors and you've got all these things just weighing down on you to perform, and it's hard to do your best surfing when you have all that pressure on you. It's an art form to get it all right, and when you do, that's when you see the brilliant performances.
On that subject of invincibility, one of the interesting things on the men's side this year, we've talked about Kelly's sailed so far over the horizon. He's sort of an outlier in a field of outliers. But, we've had generational kind of title holders since Kelly as well. We had Mick and Joel and all these sort of figures that filled that space in the years, in the midst of Kelly's dominance, I guess, too. But recently, especially this year on the men's side, we had Gabriel Medina. He was the reigning 3-time world champion. He took the first half of the year off. He came back at G-Land. While he didn't win the event, he did look scary invincible, I thought, just being on the ground and watching him like cruise through these heats and again, like just making the world's best surfers look very vulnerable against him until he eventually was stopped. And then he ended up hurting himself. He had to pull out. And then John as well, another 2-time world champion who had to pull out as well after a knee injury. So you kind of have this power vacuum on the men's side that does feel like an opportunity for, the people you mentioned, your Felipe, Jack, Ethan, Italo, and Kanoa to kind of move in and establish themselves as the best surfers in the world right now. It feels like a very interesting time in men's surfing.
It is, and it's a super good question. And I do feel like it was a chance for some of these other surfers to lift their game and rise and beg the question of like, how would they have done if John and Gabriel were healthy this year? Like, what would the top 5 have looked like? I personally do believe that Gabriel and John are definitely the best 2 surfers in the world still. But I think that this young group has made a huge jump this year. With Ethan, Kanoa, Felipe, even Griffin missing the cut with the 2 wins, and Jack. I feel like those next year is going to be incredible with a healthy John and Gabriel to see how those guys match up, because I think they're a lot closer now. And I think the gap has shrunk on the men's side. On the women's side, I was really interested in the early in the year in how the young girls were going to do, because they came out of the gate so strong in Hawaii. And, you've got this really good energy right now on the girls' side with how good the young crop is. And I think some of the girls not even on the tour right now are really turning heads, and that's super exciting for the sport. I think Katie Simmers is amazing. I think Erin Brooks is amazing. I think Sierra Kerr is amazing. I think Betty Lou is incredible. I think Molly Picklum is incredible. I really can't wait for next year to see those girls mix in. And I personally feel like 10 is too short on the women's side when you get to the cut of only 10. I think that a lot of the best stories in women's surfing happened outside of those top 10. And I'd love to see a few more girls on the tour. I think there's too many young girls getting too good too quick right now to cut it to 10. I feel like that needs to be bigger. That's just in my own personal opinion.
That's an interesting point, and while you bring it up, I'm happy to go down this side street too and get your insights, because I think it's a topic I've been obsessed with for a long time, which is, that surfing world is a community obsessed with the cult of youth, right? Like, and you see that when it comes to endorsements, you see that when it comes to attention or the media attention or whatever. It almost is one of those things where the value is about potential as opposed to achievement in a lot of ways, where, we've seen it for a long time where, like young surfers with the potential to win a world title get these big contracts, and sometimes surfers that have just won a world title, they're kind of out the door. I think it's getting better than it was maybe sort of in the mid-aughties where it felt pretty radical in some respects, but just in terms of being a young person who, let's leave the mental maturity off to the side, just the physical maturation, and just how different it is to perform at a Pro Junior QS level versus a CT level. We have seen a number of young surfers, both on the men's and women's side, qualify very young, right? Like 15, 16, 17. And I don't always know if that's the best thing, because sometimes you see surfers kind of burn out really before they've had a chance to peak as an adult athlete. So I'm saying a lot here, but the question I'm trying to get to is, from your perspective, if you had to identify the ideal 10-year championship tour window to compete at from an age perspective, is it 15 to 25? Is it 18 to 28, 20 to 30? And I appreciate it's probably different for men and women. It's probably different person to person. But generally speaking, in terms of being at peak physical ability, what do you kind of identify as that window where you'd like to see people on tour?
I think it's a little bit later. I think it's more the 20 to 30. And you're seeing that, right, with the performances too. Because, I think that you can do it a little bit too young. I think Katie not doing the tour, whereas Caroline did do the tour at her exact same age, is really interesting. Caroline to me, was pretty mature at her age and was pretty gung-ho and ready to take on the world. And I thought she was ready to go, and she sort of proved that she did well. But then in Katie's case, I think it was smart to hold back, because I feel like with those first 5 venues being Pipeline Sunset, you're thrown into that, and all of a sudden you're against Carissa Moore and Tyler Wright and Joanne Defay and 10-foot surf. It's a big hurdle, right, for a 15-year-old to go stand on the beach at Pipeline and look over and see you're against Carissa Moore. That's heavy. But I think, it begs the question a little bit. Me and my friends talk about it a lot. Should there be a rule of what's the age you could start doing the world tour? Because for mental health and these things with all the pressure that comes on a young athlete, it's a really good question. But it's hard because every athlete's different. So putting an age limit on it, I think, would be tough. You've also got the endorsement deals like, hey, these athletes, when they're on the tour, they make a lot more money than when they're off the tour, and that's in their contracts. And so they're making these big decisions. So for me, I think the prime years are more the 20 to 30 age range, and even beyond that.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one from, I guess, my day job and working with our team on like design of the tours and competition framework and those structures. Because you're totally right, and I actually think I know there used to be a rule, I don't know if there currently is one, but I'm pretty sure the rule is 18, but then anyone that qualifies younger, they get like an automatic waiver if they apply for it, kind of thing. And it's hard to say like you have to graduate high school or whatever, because it's different in different countries and we're a global sport. But I do think moving forward, it is sort of something where you talk to the brands in the surf industry and you talk to the WSL and how they're structuring, whether it's the Pro Junior, the regional qualifying series, Challenger series, and not so much create hard and fast rules, but just create like the wet clay structure so that if someone is performing very, very well at 17, but maybe they're not ready for the CT, as you pointed out, they're not missing out by not taking their spot, whether financially or just opportunity-wise. There's a place for them if they want to stay and take another year to mature. I kind of feel like that's where we're heading. We're not there yet, but it is something where I think it's like the WSL can't solve it on its own. The industry can't solve it on its own. It's going to be kind of this collaborative thing where, the community gets together and says, these are the ideal spaces for different age surfers to end up. And of course, even once it's established, there's always going to be outliers, right? Where it's like, here's a 16-year-old that has their shit together and they're ready to win the world title. Off they go.
Yeah, totally. That's why I don't think you can put an age limit on it, because everyone's so different. Like you said, every country is so different. But I do feel like the important thing is that you're building them for success and long careers and not burnout and not this mental fatigue, and all those things are super, super important to a young athlete.
It's not a new phenomenon either. I'll go back to the Bill Ballard's Archie. I think everyone talked about like Archie and David Eggers, like turning pro and going on tour as teenagers, and I want to say it was Jeff Booth, but I think he was very funny where he just goes, oh, this is going to be nuts. Like we were all like, this is going to be nuts. Like, I hope they do okay. Like it was just kind of like so Wild West that everyone was hands off and being like, all right, let's give them a lot of money and see what happens.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. There's a lot of cases when I first started the tour too, but those two are really good examples. They were both so talented, and everyone thought they were shoo-ins for world titles someday, and it didn't work out that way. But that was, I traveled with Archie to South Africa when he was like 15 or 16. It was pretty wild, but he was crazy talented. But a lot of good memories of those times. But in those cases, Taj Burrow held back a year, and I think it worked great for him as well. He felt like I know Maurice Cole, he was working with him, and he felt like, hey, you're good enough to qualify the next year. Or let's wait a year. And in both those cases with Katie and Taj, it looks like Katie's going to qualify easy again this year. So it worked out good.
I think that's a good comparable. Going back to the outer known Tahiti Pro, you brought up that really cool story, right? Where it's like, we're building this framework out to create these momentum points and create stakes and amplify the stakes in a way that elevates the surfing and doesn't compromise it. And I think, we're never perfect, but we've moved in some really good directions. And one of the stories you brought up was just, that spot for the finals coming down between that match between Lakey and Brisa. It was such a cool story on the day. Another one that was percolating through the event, even from the start, was that idea of who's going to hold the men's number one spot, right? Because you had Felipe Toledo, who'd had a lights out year. You had Jack Robinson, who was very, very dangerous. And I am of the opinion that it's really unfair to kind of label Felipe as someone who's not an elite level surfer in critical waves. I think he's had a little bit of bad luck. I do think sometimes that psychology gets to people as well, where he has this nightmare opening round heat. He doesn't really get any waves, and he knows what everyone's saying about him, et cetera, et cetera. And you'd have to think that plays on his mind. And then, you've got someone like Jack who historically is very, very lethal in waves of consequence. We had a big swell for Tahiti. And if it weren't for kind of a rampaging Nathan Hedge, you could be looking at a situation where Jack was the number one seed heading into lowers. And I bring this up because I'm curious to get your insights on that. Didn't happen, but Felipe had to kind of figure out how to distance himself from not the ideal Tahiti performance he wanted and really focus himself on the finals. That can't be an easy thing to do.
I think it's probably really hard on him. I was there watching all the warm-ups and just the lead up. I was staying in the same place as Jack. I was staying with Lakey right next door. So watching all that go down, I really expected Philippe to just kind of go Rambo mode and just kind of show everyone, hey, I'm going to charge no matter what. I'm going to give it a solid dig. And I was bummed that he didn't do that watching the heat. His first round heat, he was 8 foot pumping. There was some really good waves coming to him. He opted not to take off on them. And I was like, Philippe, just have a dig. You're so talented and so good in these waves. And he just decided, no, I'm not going to do it. Maybe he was thinking I'm going to save myself for lowers. On the other hand, you had Jack just going full Rambo mode. Every free surf, he was the best guy there. I really thought Jack was going to take the number one spot because it looked like Philippe just kind of wasn't interested in Tahiti. Even in the warm-ups, he wasn't really. I didn't see him free surfing. Maybe he was. But it felt to me like he kind of just went, hey, you know what? I'm going to focus on winning lowers this year, and I'm just going to kind of let it happen here in Tahiti. Whatever happens, happens. I'm going to have a good time. So I think that may play into his performance at lowers as much as he is probably trying to block it out as he should. And is as incredible as he is at lowers, I feel like there'll be a lot of pressure on him this year at lowers, and a lot of people chatting about what we just brought up about his performance at places like Pipeline and Chopu. And if you look at past world champions, you look at John and Gabriel and Kelly Slater, and they all are incredible surfers at Chopu and Pipeline. So Philippe's had this amazing year, and at times where he's definitely been the best surfer of the year, as we talked about earlier, like at Bell's and a few of these other spots. But to be the world champion, you've got to perform in all the venues. And the way the format's set up, maybe you don't, because he didn't perform at Pipe and Tahiti, and he's still the favorite at Trestles. So I think Philippe's an awesome guy and an incredible surfer, and he'll be a super worthy world champ if he wins. But I was just really rooting for him to really go for it and just kind of show the world, hey, everyone shut up. I'm incredible at Chopu. But he decided not to in those key moments. The next heat, he did redeem himself a bit with some sevens. And it was the next day when it was a fair bit smaller. And, maybe he just didn't want to get hurt, like I said. So I'm a huge Philippe fan, and I want him to do well, and he'll be a worthy world champ. But, man, I was rooting for him to just kind of take charge in Tahiti.
Yeah. Well, high drama at the end of the road. We're going to do one more break to get a word in from our sponsors. And when we come back, we're going to get Mike Parsons' breakdown of the upcoming WSL Final Five. We'll be right back. So we are, again, this is going to land on the eve of the 2022 Rip Curl WSL Finals. And I wanted to take this opportunity having you on to kind of dissect the strengths and weaknesses of each of our contenders heading into the event here at Lower Trestles. Your background as an elite level competitor yourself, as an elite level coach, you've seen so much in surfing. I'd love to get kind of your unfiltered thoughts on strengths and weaknesses. So I will start on the women's side, and we'll start from the back and we'll move forward. So someone like Stephanie Gilmore, 7-time world champion, had the opening heat last year as the number 4 seed, didn't work out for her. Looking at the likely conditions for Lower Trestles this year, what would you kind of peg as the chief strength and chief weakness for someone like Stephanie Gilmore?
I think the way the forecast looks, 4 to 5 foot lower, Stephanie's going to be deadly this year. She definitely would have learned from. Stephanie's not really a morning surfer. She doesn't surf good heats first thing off the bat. She tends to build momentum, and if you're going to beat Stephanie, you usually beat her in the earlier rounds. So I think if she can beat Brisa in that first heat, she could run the table and get all the way to Carissa. I think she has a good chance. There's been some performances in the past at lowers where she's been the best surfer out there. I remember a few high 9s or maybe even 10s in events past. If it's 4 foot rights, I think she's deadly. And I even think that if she just had 1 heat to surf or 2 against Carissa, that's a real coin toss. Obviously, running the table and winning the title is going to be really tough, but Trestles is a perfect way for Stephanie. I still think she has the magic. She's going to be super tough to beat this year, in my opinion. I think she wins that opening heat against Brisa.
Yeah, and do you think that weakness is almost the same as last year, which is she's not a morning heat competitor, and that's really kind of the thing. Like, she's just going to have to get through it, and if she does, she may build that momentum.
I do think that that'll be the case, and I think her losing last year will be fresh in her mind, and I think Trestles is the perfect venue for her. Her style and how she rides a 4 to 5 foot right is still as good as anybody in the world, and if she's hungry, I know she will be. I think you couldn't have a better final venue for Stephanie than Lower Trestles.
Brisa Hennessy wasn't actually on tour at this point last year. She'd fallen off, and as we talked about how to work her way back on via the Challenger Series, she's now world number 4. She's going to face Steph in the opening round. Strength and weakness for Brisa Hennessy.
Her strength are her frontside carve. She has a really strong frontside carve. She's ultra consistent and strong. If she has a big closeout section at lowers, I could see her doing some big layback finishes. She's strong on her backside. She's a really strong competitor. Mentally, I think she's really strong this year. I think Glenn Paul's done a really good job in building her confidence. She's going to be tough because Brisa is going to be ready. That's what Stephanie's got to be careful of. Brisa's going to put the work in. I've already seen her down there surfing really good 2 weeks in advance. So her strength is going to be, she's going to probably try to jump on a lead with Stephanie, get some scores on the board. Stephanie will probably wait, and Stephanie needs to be careful that it goes quick, and Brisa could build a lead and create an upset there. So she's really consistent, strong-minded, has a great frontside wrap. Those are all her strengths.
Any weaknesses for Brisa?
I just think that talent-wise, when it comes right down to it, if the waves are firing and they both have opportunities, I don't feel she's as quite as good of a surfer as Steph. So if they're matched, Brisa's going to have to wind up on better waves to beat her. I think Stephanie just has a little more talent to me on a right point.
So the winner of that opening match is going to face last year's world runner-up, someone we've talked about a little bit already, Tatiana Weston Webb. Looking at Tati this year compared to last year, maybe with the experience of last year, positive and negative, what would you say Tati's assessment is for this year's event?
Well, certainly last year will still be weighing on her pretty heavily, but she's had such a strong year, and at moments throughout this year, like J-Bay, and a few other events. She's been the best surfer there. She's gotten way better at her surfing. She has a wicked frontside layback now. She's surfing tighter to the pocket. Her backhand surfing has improved. She looks stronger. She's got her swagger going. She knows she can win. She's got good information from Ross Williams. She has a solid program, and I just feel like she's going to be confident and go there to win and thinking she's going to win. I think she's gotten way better than last year. So that's her biggest strength. She's a better surfer, and she'll be mentally stronger than last year because of the losses. So she's going to be deadly at lowers, but I still think, with that forecast, I still would put my money on Stephanie to beat her, because I just think Stephanie, and if she's hitting her stride on those rights, can beat Tati.
Yeah. Point of difference, we talk about a lot, pretty much at every event. Tatiana being the only goofy footer on the women's side this year, do you think that's an advantage for her in the sense of it will be different surfing than Steph Gilmore, obviously, if they're both going right, and maybe because they hadn't seen, a backhander yet, that could help?
Yeah, I definitely think it could, that point of difference. You can definitely get tighter in the pocket on your backhand, and lowers is a really good wave to go right on. The other thing we're not really touching on is it could be lefts. You have high tide, and if the swell has a little more west in it, the lefts get really good. And Tati could use that to her advantage as well. We saw Joanne Defay last year against Stephanie. In the morning, the tide was a little higher, and she got a couple quick lefts and beat Stephanie that way. We saw Gabriel win the title on those lefts as the tide got higher. So, I think the point of difference on your backside is a really good point. If Tati's surfing tighter to the pocket than Stephanie or Brisa wins, that will be something that could be an advantage for sure.
Yeah. Well, and you just brought her up. The number 2 seed, whoever makes it through those opening 2 matches, is Reunion Island Joanne Defay. One of my favorite stories, just because of she just came out of, she's been on tour for a number of years, but really came out of not one of the major surfing centers and really had to fight hard to get on tour. And it just continuously is just so psychologically sharp. She's so good in reef break. She's such a sound surfer. She's riding for O'Neill now, which I think is well earned in a lot of ways. And I really like her, but I'm curious to get your read on her strengths and weaknesses at lower trestles.
Oh my God, she's so strong, top to bottom. Mentally, her surfing's gotten way better in the last years. Her consistency is crazy. She's kind of reminds me of, her surfing's way different, but she's a lot like Sally in the sense that she's always going to put like 2 7s on the board. Like, her competitive savvy is incredible. She reads the ocean really well. She rarely is in a position where she's coming from behind. She's consistent. She picks really good waves. She's crazy strong. She never falls. And she has some big turns. Like her best turn, I think, is maybe her backhand surfing is amazing. She always wins on the reef breaks going backhand. But her frontside closeout sort of layback jam is kind of rivaling Carissa these days and is really strong. I think I could see her using that to her advantage at lowers. And really just her consistency and her competitive paralysis is really strong. So, and again, she'll be one of those athletes that learned from last year, and she was pretty heartbroken when she lost. So she'll be really tough this year. I expect her to be another gear up from last year down there.
Yeah. And then the monster at the end of the dream, you have the reigning 5-time world champion, Carissa Moore, who is not enough can be said about how good of a surfer she is. Although I think she's even admitted that she didn't surf her best in the finals last year, and having been on the sand, observed how particularly rattled she was when she lost that opening match to Tatiana. Strengths and weaknesses for Carissa Moore at this year's event?
Well, her strengths are her surfing and her, just like you said, she's an absolute beast on an open face, right or left. She's gotten incredibly good on her backhand. But when she has room to move and a right hand point break or anything where she has a little room to create distance and do those big swooping carves and big layback jams, and nobody does it better. And she does it better than some of the guys. She's unbelievable surfer. So her talent, her surfing, that's her strength. Her weakness is mental. It's sometimes if you get a lead on her or you get an early start or you can rattle her where she can spiral the wrong direction. And sometimes for as good as she is, I don't know why, but she loses her confidence pretty easily. And she usually rebounds and she can rely on her surfing to get her back and win because she's just so darn good. But if someone can get a lead on her, win that first heat, and really apply that pressure, they have a chance. But it's a big task. I mean, I still think she's the best surfer in the world right now by a pretty big margin. It's hers to lose for sure. And she's dialed in with her equipment. She's dialed in at lowers. She's still hungry. She's still completely ready. And I think she's up to the task and a huge favorite. But those other four girls have a really good chance as well. I think it'll be someone close. I mean, I honestly think Stephanie will get to the final. I just have a feeling that it'll be Steph against Carissa. But I think at that point, I think Steph will be pretty gassed if she can get there. Like I said earlier, I think if they were matched up right off the bat in a final, that's a 50-50 for me when Steph's really on her game. But I think Carissa would beat her if she can get there. She'll just be fresh and ready to go.
Interesting. Well, switching to the men's side, the opening match is between two surfers whom you have a lot of experience with. Both of them, actually. You've got Kanoe Igarashi, who you manage, and then Italo Ferreira, who I believe you've coached in the past, or at least sort of worked with a little bit. How do you see that opening match going between the both of them? You know, what are they're very different surfers, but what would be their strengths at lowers compared to their weaknesses?
It's a super good heat. Kanoa obviously has been pretty brilliant this year, has had some crazy heats. He actually had a come from behind win against Italo. I think it was at J Bay in the dying moments. So they've had I think it's 2-1 Kanoa advantage between the two. I worked with Italo last year during the finals at lowers, so got to hang out with him for a couple of weeks, and his preparation was incredible. The guy doesn't leave anything to doubt. I mean, he'll be there early. He'll put the time in. He's got mad skills. Obviously his aerial game is what has got him to where he's at, along with the surfing and heavy waves, like winning the title at Pipe. But I think Italo needs to make a little adjustment this year and go to the air and go to his what's gotten him the biggest scores. And last year it was kind of bigger, and he had to surf against Philippe, and it was mostly right, so it was a little lower tide, and he didn't really get a chance to go to the air. And I think this year you're going to see a different Italo come out firing. And if it's lefts on like a mid tide, I could see him doing 2 reverses a wave with variations in his errors and crazy carves and lay everything. So I think you're going to see a really tough Italo in that heat. He hasn't surfed his best this year, not as good as the year before. And Kanoa has surfed his very best this year. So I think it's a really close toss-up. Kanoa has more experience at lowers. That one is so hard for me to call a winner. I think maybe I'd lean Kanoa in that one just because he's really on a roll right now and he's so confident and he has experience at lowers. But man, that's kind of a flip of the coin.
And the winner of that match will face the current world number 3, Ethan Ewing, who is actually on his second round on the championship tour. He qualified and then fell off and then qualified again. But the kid is so strong and has had so many comparisons to Andy Irons and all these other surfers. But it's been very cool this year to see him kind of hit his straps, particularly with that win and just pumping Jeffreys Bay. It was such beautiful surfing. But, you know, at lower Trestles, how do you think his particular approach is going to translate, both pros and cons, I guess?
It's going to translate really good. With the forecast, I think the better the surf, the better Ethan's chance is. If it's 5 to 6 foot lowers, I think he's the favorite for me. I think he wins the world title. He reminds me a lot of Mick, a lot of comparisons to Andy for sure, but he has every type of turn in the book. And if it's outside of going above the lip, I think he's the best surfer in the world right now. reminds me of Mick. He's got variations in every single snap, wrap, carve, blast, layback gouges. He's got the power, like you mentioned. I think when he's on, like we saw at J-Bay, no one can match without John being on the tour or Gabriel. I don't think anyone matches his power. And if it's 5 foot lowers, I think he's throwing big high nines. I think it's going to happen. So he's deadly at lowers. I think the only way he gets beat is by someone like Italo, one of his competitors, Philippe, going to the air and just really doing that above the lip surfing mixed with the crazy carves and snaps. I think that's the only thing that can stop him, because without going above the lip, I think he's the best surfer in the Final Five on the men's side. So he's going to be deadly. There's a few clips on his Instagram from last year at lowers where I show him to Lakey and Caroline all the time. They laugh at me, but I'm like, this is as good as you could surf a wave. I mean, he does every type of crazy carve, and he does it with such speed throughout and such flow and all those things. Like, it's poetry, like perfect, crazy, radical, everything. So he's deadly.
That's going to be the interesting thing, I think, with Ethan and almost pretty much every other surfer on the men's side is, as you pointed out, it will kind of come down to the judges. Like, if Ethan is 100% on and he can go above the lip, but as you said, primarily on rail and fin drifts and doing these amazing maneuvers, and then someone like an Italo or a Jack or Felipe or Canoa are on as well, but they're taking it to the air, it'll really come down to the judging to say which surfing did you prefer more, because you could get 10s kind of either way in those conditions. So I think that's going to be really interesting. And someone who we've talked about a bit, but has kind of a foot in both realms, maybe not as strong a singular foot as Ethan on one side or Felipe on the other, but is Jack Robinson, who, as we've talked about, is really, really been impressive from a mental strength standpoint, but also just his ability to improve fairly dramatically in non kind of waves of consequence. How do you see Jack performing out at Lower Trestles this year?
Oh, I think really good as well. I've been watching him already this past week, and it's amazing to watch how good he's surfing out there. He's so dialed in on what wave to take already. He's really extra radical. I think he's gonna have to maybe go above the lip to beat like an Ethan or Canoa or Italo. So I feel like he probably will. What really blows my mind about Jack is just his paralysis in the ocean, like figuring out what wave to ride. Like and this year watching him under pressure moments, like I talked about a little bit earlier, getting the score when he needs it, 5 minutes to go, needing a big score and performing at his very best on that wave right when he needs it, like world champion stuff. So I feel like he's going to go in there thinking, I'm winning the title right now, and he might just do it. I mean, he's that guy right now. And I feel like this year he's been the most impressive in terms of how much better he's gotten, how strong he's been mentally, how much he's improved. All those things. I think lowers is not his best wave, I wouldn't think. He's best in hollow waves over a reef break, obviously growing up in Western Australia. But man, has he improved in all the other waves. So I wouldn't be surprised if he goes all the way and wins the title. He's in a great spot in second. Whoever comes up against him is going to be deadly, though. And then you've got the daunting task of Philippe, the best surfer probably ever at lowers, waiting for you. So, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did it.
Right. And maybe we've already kind of touched on Philippe's weakness in just having to kind of psychologically overcome Tahiti to a bit. I'd maybe even throw in just the weight of expectation of he's been a title contender for so long and he's in pole position this year. And sometimes that's hard to kind of focus on the task at hand when you're like, this is supposed to come to me, and but then on the strength side, as you pointed out, he's maybe the best surfer ever at Lower Trestles. Is that a kind of a fair assessment on where you look at Philippe heading into this event?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I kind of like Carissa on the women's side. I think it's Philippe's to lose. I feel like with his performance last year, he came so close against Gabriel. He was on a heater out there, surfing incredible. watching him free surf out there, he spends a lot of time living in San Clemente now, so I see him surf out there a fair bit, and he can do everything. He can do the craziest, fastest lightning carves, every type of carve, backside, front side. He can do every type of air, insane full rotations right into another crazy snap without even shuffling his feet. I mean, it's like video game surfing stuff. So if he can click into that Felipe that we know he does, he'll probably get the title. But I do think there will be a lot wearing on him because you're expected to do it. You've been so close so many times before. That's a lot of pressure on his shoulders. He wants it so bad that, if he can let go of that, surf very relaxed and aggressive and really go for it and get after it, I think, he probably pulls it off. But yeah, it's an interesting one because it's tough when you're expected to win. I feel like in my career, I always surfed my best against the best guys when I wasn't expected to win. So, that's when your best performances come out. So the true champions, a world champion, can perform when they're expected to win. So we'll see what he does, but he's definitely the favorite.
Well, I'm excited. We did put a feeler out for questions from our Instagram and Twitter communities at the Lineup Pod, and we got a lot back, but we've whittled them down to 3 for you. So the first question comes from South Coast David, who asks, do you think there should be a regular season champ and a finals champ, kind of like in some other sports?
That's a good question. I do, but it just doesn't seem like it would have the weight. I mean, the undisputed world champ is what every one of these athletes is striving for. So I think it would be cool to have acknowledge the winner of the season, now that we have the Final Five. But to me, it's all about the world title, and that's what they all are going for. It's almost like, the QS winner is awesome, and it's incredible feat for that athlete, but that athlete is instantly thinking, how do I win the world title someday? So
right.
Good, super good question. I do think they probably should have a season champion, and integrate that into the format. But overall, it's all about the world champion.
I can tell a funny story because it's never going to come to pass because it finally got shut down for dead. But we have talked about this at the WSL, and we were toying around with like, okay, well, how do you create an award for the regular season's champion that is honoring the performance but isn't sort of cannibalizing, as you pointed out, the undisputed world title, which you have to win at the finals. And we kind of hovered around this idea of like, well, what if we called it the Kelly Slater Award? He's the greatest living competitive surfer of all time. The final event is an outer known event, which is his company. It's in Tahiti. Tahiti's Chopu translates to the Wall of Skulls. And I'd pitched this to Kelly and he was into it, and then I pitched it to everyone else and they hated it. But I said, what if, because Tiffany's wanted to work with us on a trophy, I said to Kelly, what if we computer mapped your skull and the trophy was just this beautiful silver version of your skull? And he looked at me like I was insane, and then he kind of was like, that's kind of cool. And then I took it back to the WSL and they're like, no fucking way. Like, get out of here. I still think it's a good idea, but I can share it with the world because it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good idea too, but
yeah. Next question is from @WillyGoat0230, who asks, if Carissa wins the world title this year, what do you think her chances of overtaking Steph with the future roster that's coming on to the championship tour? So Steph, for listeners out there, she's got 7 world titles. Carissa currently has 5 as of recording, or as of posting, I could say. If she wins this year, she'll be at 6, so she'll be 1 off of Steph. But as Mike rightly pointed out, the generation that's coming onto the championship tour is no joke. But if she does win this year, Mike, what do you kind of give her chances for potentially matching and then overtaking Steph?
I think her chances are really good. It just comes down to her motivation. If she, she's at that age where she's probably starting to think about kids and those things and how long am I going to do this? She has, obviously, if she wins this year, she'll have 6 titles and a gold medal. But knowing Carissa and just that looming tie with Steph or even more, I think she'll probably go for it. and I think her odds are really high that she'll win the world title again next year. It all comes down to motivation. I think if she's all in and she wants that, I think she's the favorite again next year.
Very cool. And the last question that we've picked from our social media friends is from @_Freddy_6, who says, I'm going to put you on the spot. Who's going to win the men's and women's titles this year?
Oh, that's awesome. I've been debating my friends about this every day. I'm going to say Ethan Ewing with the come from behind win, world champion on the men's side, and a Steph Gilmore final against Carissa Moore. Carissa Moore is 6-time world champ. I know that's not really going out on a limb, but I just think fresh and ready to go. She wins. I think Ethan he's got the confidence right now and the dynamic surfing on the rights. I know that's crazy to say with Felipe being as good as he is at lowers, but I just have a feeling. We'll see.
I like it. Well, thanks to everyone who wrote in at the lineup pod. We are now down to our final segment for you, Snips. It is time for the lightning round presented by BF Goodrich. So these are 10 questions for you to answer as quickly as you can. If you could only have one board set up for the rest of your life, single fin, twin fin, thruster, quad bonzer, or finless, which would you choose?
Super easy thruster.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Burrito or pizza?
Pizza.
Last book you read?
She's been a while. Into Thin Air by John Krakauer about the 1996 Everest tragedy. Climbing book.
Great book. Best surf film ever?
Free Ride.
One wave you never have to go back to?
Oh, God, such a good question. Brazil, beach breaks.
If you only got to surf one wave for the rest of your life?
That's another really good question. If it's really good and nobody out, lowers.
Best person to share a lineup with?
My son, Grant, who's 14.
Worst person to share a lineup with?
Oh, jeez. That's a hard one.
Last one. Finish this sentence. I will next achieve a state of happiness by...
having dinner with my wife and 14-year-old son tonight.
Wonderful. Mike Parsons, thank you so much for coming on this special Rip Curl WSL Finals edition of The Lineup. We are going to have a full in-depth episode with you in the future, but really, really appreciate your insights on the eve of this important event. And I'll look forward to seeing you down there.
Yeah, awesome. Can't wait to see it. It's going to be so exciting. Crazy, great talent in it. Good forecast. So let's do it.